At the turn of the 20th century, women were socially acceptable to work outside the home. This specifically applied to women that were unmarried. However, this was no choice for many poor and working-class wives, which led to working outside the home to supplement the family income. Since jobs were supposed to be temporary for women, they had to often be employed in jobs that required lower-level skills. It was the start of new opportunities, but jobs were very limited for promotion and paid lower salaries than jobs for men. By 1901, over 13% of Canadian workers outside the home were women. Majority worked as domestic servants in mills, factories, and sweatshops in the clothing industry. This increased tremendously by 1914 as over 21% of the Canadian workforce was women. Greater numbers were finishing high school and going to university. Although more women were becoming doctors and lawyers, these careers continued to be difficult ones for women to enter.
Increasing numbers of women became convinced that they should have an equal share in making political decisions. In 1917, in an effort to win votes, the Union government under Robert Borden passed the Wartime Elections Act, granting the mothers, sisters, daughters, and wives of soldiers the right to vote in federal elections. During the election campaign, in an effort to win more votes, Borden promised to extend the right to vote to all women over 21. By the end of the war, the right to vote in federal as well as in provincial elections was extended to most women. Native and Asian women, like Native and Asian men, still did not have the right to vote.
The young Charlotte Whitten, celebrating with her supporters after election as mayor of Ottawa, joined the newly formed Canadian Council on Child Welfare in 1920. She was one of the new women of the 1920s. She had just graduated from university and was committed to improving society, especially the lives of immigrant and neglected children. She advocated training for those who worked with such children and high standards in homes where they were placed. Whitten's contributions to Canadian life continued for over 50 years. The Council on Child Welfare broadened its work in the 1930s and became the Canadian Welfare Council. Whitten's focus then turned to relief for the destitute and unemployed during the Depression. Adelaide Hunter Hoodless was a Canadian educational reformer who founded the International Women's Organization, otherwise known as the Women's Institute. She was born in Ontario and is the youngest of 13, with the death of her father and with her mother taking over the farm. Adelaide was isolated of her youth. Adelaide's achievements was indeed very substantial, and they signaled a new era of activism for women at the dawn of a new century. Her death in 1910 was deeply felt at the time. Adelaide had been commemorated in varied ways throughout the century since her death. Winning the vote and the right to be elected was one step towards political equality for women, but there were many obstacles to overcome. Many women, and some women, This last issue came to a head through the efforts of Emily Murphy. Murphy was appointed a magistrate in 1916, thereby becoming the first woman judge in the British Empire. In her own court, however, lawyers challenged her right to preside. They claimed that women were not considered persons under the British North American Act. discovered that any 5 people could petition the Supreme Court for its constitutional ruling. In 1927, Murphy and 4 other women activists from Alberta petitioned the Supreme Court to rule whether the word persons in the British North America Act included women. Refusing to abandon the case, the Alberta Five appealed to the Privy Council in Britain, at that time the highest court of appeal for Canadians. In October 1929, this council ruled that women were persons and therefore eligible for appointment to the Senate. In 1931, Prime Minister King appointed Karine Wilson as Canada's first female person senator. In 1921 federal election, Agnes McPhail, running for the Progressive Party, won her seat in rural Ontario, Grey Goose, to become Canada's first female MP. McPhail served as an MP until her defeat in 1940. While in Parliament, she supported protective tariffs to benefit Canadian farmers and called for prison reform. In the mid-1930s, her efforts led to the investigation of Canada's prisons. McPhail also founded the Elizabeth Fry Society of Canada, an organization to help women who had been imprisoned. McPhail was a strong internationalist and the first Canadian woman to serve as the League of Nations delegate. She also served as an Ontario MPP in the 1940s and 1950s. Her long career and her contributions were recognized in 1954 when she was to be appointed to the Canadian Senate, but she died before the appointment was made. Women's lives during World War II changed drastically. Thousands of women overseas served as nurses, ambulance drivers, workers in clubs and canteens for soldiers on leave, and personnel from army officers. The largest role played by women during the war, however, was replacing men who had gone overseas. Emily Carr was born in 1871 and died in 1945. She was known as the number 1 of Canada's greatest artists, but she was not recognized until the end of her career. For the most of her life, she ran a boarding house in Victoria. She went on scouting trips near home by studying the culture of coastal Indians who knew her as Cleaver. She began writing later in her life her first book, Cleaver, which was an instant success. By the end of the 20th century, women had made considerable gains compared to earlier in the century. By the 1900s, women held offices at all levels of government. Jeanne Servais became the first woman Speaker of the House of Commons in 1980. In 1984, she became Canada's first female Governor-General. Kim Campbell served as Prime Minister, although for only a short period in 1993. The federal NDP party has had 2 female leaders since 1989, Audrey McLaughlin and Alexa McDonough. Catherine S. Kalbeck was Premier of Prince Edward Island from 1993 to 1996. More women than ever before were elected to Parliament in 1997. In some university professional programs such as law, where there had previously been very few or no women, women now outnumbered men. By the end of the century, it was clear that women enjoyed greater levels of equality than their predecessors.